Now let me talk about the second aspect of the church Satan uses as an instrument to keep Jews from believing in Jesus. And that is the church's preaching of another Jesus, a counterfeit Christ, who is not the Jesus you read about in the Bible. Now what do you mean by another Jesus? What do you mean by counterfeit Christ? Well, there are some churches who preach a Jesus who did away with those Old Testament commandments. He did away with all that stuff. He changed the Sabbath from seventh day to Sunday. He did away with the dietary laws. He did away with the calendar. He did away with a lot of other things out of the Old Testament. Why is that a mistake? Well, you're all familiar, I think, with Matthew 5:17, the mantra of the Messianic movement, as I call it, where Jesus said to not even think that he came to abolish the law. From the very start, early in his ministry, he knew people would misunderstand some of the things he taught, some of the things he did. He knew people would misconstrue what he did and said. He knew some people would erroneously think that he came to abolish the Torah. So from the very start, to nip it in the bud, he says, look, don't even think that I've come to abolish the Torah. I've not come to abolish it. So in effect, he's saying, whatever you hear me say after this, get that idea out of your head. I didn't come to abolish the Old Testament laws. Furthermore, Jewish people who take their faith seriously are familiar with Deuteronomy chapter 13. I'm not going to turn and read there right now, but paraphrase the chapter. Basically, Deuteronomy 13 says, if a prophet comes along, and even if he does signs and wonders and miracles, and then tells you to depart from the commandments of God's Torah, God's law, he said, don't follow him. He's a false prophet. So, if Jesus really did come along and do signs and wonders, which he knew he did signs and wonders, but if Jesus really did teach to forsake the commandments of God's law, then the Jews would be right to reject him as a false prophet. They can't even consider him as a candidate for the Messiah if he did away with the laws of the Old Testament. They would be right to reject him as a false prophet. See, Jews who take their faith seriously, and they're a minority, they believe in the coming of the Messiah. I've got a book here called Mashiach, Hebrew word for Messiah, written by a Jewish man who is not a believer in Jesus. As a matter of fact, he's an anti-missionary. He does his utmost to persuade Jews that Jesus was not the Messiah. But this is a very, very good book because it helps you understand the Jewish concept of the Messiah, what they're looking for. And I'm going to share some things out of this book with you. But, if you ask a Jewish person who takes his faith seriously, you look at the cover of the book, it says here, I believe with complete faith in the coming of Mashiach. This is one of the 13 principles of the Jewish faith. One of the 13 things that a Jew is, to be a good Jew, he's required to believe. I believe with complete faith in the coming of Mashiach. Though he tarry, nonetheless, I await him every day that he will come. So they are expecting him to come. Now, if you ask a Jewish person, how are you going to recognize the Messiah? How are you going to know who he is when he comes? Their answer is, whoever comes along and does the things that the Messiah is supposed to do, that man will be the Messiah. That makes sense, doesn't it? If the Bible talks about a coming Messiah, and it says he's going to do this, he's going to do that, he's going to do this, he's not going to do that, well, if you get somebody to match that description, you know that person will be the Messiah. So whoever does the things the Messiah is supposed to do is going to be a candidate for the Messiah in their minds. But if somebody comes along and doesn't do those things, then they can't even consider him as a possible candidate for the Messiah. And that is why they don't believe in Jesus. Because the rabbis say, if you ask about Jesus, if they know a little bit about him, they'll say, well, number one, Jesus didn't uphold and teach the Torah. Number two, Jesus didn't regather the 12 tribes of Israel and restore the kingdom to Israel. Number three, Jesus didn't put an end to suffering and death and bring universal peace and harmony to the earth. So 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out. We can't even consider that guy as a candidate for the Messiah. Because he didn't uphold and teach the Torah. Well, why do they think he didn't uphold and teach the Torah? Mainly because they haven't read the New Testament. And they've looked at Christians instead, because Christians are the only New Testament Bible they've read, and they see Christians not keeping the Torah. I mean, some of it, most of it they keep, but they see Christians don't keep the Sabbath. Christians eat pork. Christians don't celebrate Passover and these other holidays. So Jesus must have started a brand new religion. Well, the fact is, Jesus did uphold and teach the Torah. He did teach obedience to the commandments of God's law, and not just for Jewish believers only. He told the disciples, the so-called Great Commission, he said, go and make disciple of who? Other Jews? No. He says, go and make disciples of all nations, the Goyim, the Gentiles. And how are you to make disciples of the Goyim, the Gentiles? He says, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. So you see what he's saying to the apostles? He said, you guys, my Jewish disciples, my Jewish apostles, I'm sending you guys to go and make disciples of the Gentiles, and you teach the Gentiles to obey all things that I commanded you, my Jewish disciples. So did he command his Jewish disciples to keep the Torah? Certainly. Matthew 5:17. So if he taught the Jewish disciples, you keep the Torah, think not I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish, but to fulfill. Verily I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the Torah, till all be fulfilled. If he taught the Jewish disciples to keep the Torah, then they were to teach the Gentiles to keep the Torah, even the least of the commandments.